Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Goucher Environmental Dialogues. I'm Dr. Jen DeRosa. I'm the director of our Environmental Sustainability and Management program at Goucher College, and the Goucher Environmental Dialogues are a web-based speaker series featuring cultivated conversations with environmental sustainability and climate leaders, visionaries, and innovators. And this series is hosted by Goucher College's Master of Arts in Environmental Sustainability and Management. If you have any interest in our program or any questions about that, I believe I'll be hosting an information session in October. I want to say it's October 28th, but that seems like a long ways away. So stay tuned. I will later on include a link to our link tree, which will have access to future webinars as well and the recordings of our webinars. And I will also be sending out probably tomorrow the recording of this webinar. So our conversation today considers the state of environmental politics and policy changes in the United States over the last 6 months, because things have been going on. And our guest today is Dr. Chris Torres. Chris is currently the Jane and Robert Meyerhoff Assistant Professor for Environmental Studies at Goucher College. He completed his PhD in Public Policy and Administration at Boise State University, and his training is at the intersection of philosophy, environmental studies, policy studies, and public administration. And prior to joining us at Goucher College, he taught at Connecticut College, the College of Idaho, Boise State University. And at Goucher, Chris teaches all sorts of courses like the Introduction to Environmental Studies, Environmental Justice, and soon courses covering U.S. environmental politics, policy, and law. He also serves as the co-director of the Language House program. And his current research project that he's working on right now is looking to better understand conservative environmental values and how they shape U.S. environmental politics and policy. Other research interests include exploring the relationship between public administration, public perceptions of bureaucracy, and public trust in democratic institutions. So please join me. I know you guys are watching a webinar, so you can't turn on your audio and you can't turn on your camera, but you can use the chat. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Chris by indicating in the chat where you're logging in from. And if you have any questions during our conversation today, you can definitely ask them in the chat, and I will give voice to them usually about in the middle or the end of our webinar. So thank you for joining us, you guys. And Chris, welcome. I hope you're doing well on this hot summer day.
Yeah, hi. Well, thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. And yeah, I've been able to stay relatively cool today, so that's better.
Good. Yeah, I know we've had some storms really rolling in almost every evening too. So I'll kind of start with my first question. I understand that you are deeply interested in public policy and the environment. Could you tell me, just maybe looking back a little bit, what sparked your interest and led to your academic career?
Yeah, I think like most answers to this kind of question, it's a long and winding road. The first half of my academic training for my undergraduate and master's degrees was mostly environmental science and the humanities. So I know I took astrophysics, soil chemistry, biometeorology, and ecology, but also environmental history, literature, philosophy. So I really sharpened up on a lot of those things. But I remember, I think it was the second year of my master's degree, and I asked a question in a philosophy course, something along the lines of like, oh, well, how will we know if that idea actually plays out in this community or that community? And then a professor turned to me and said, that's a good question, but that's an empirical question, and we don't do those here. And so I thought to myself, well, I want to do empirical questions then. So I took a bit of a left turn. And that's why I chose to do my PhD in public policy administration, to learn, after knowing like 500 years of Western history and philosophy, I wanted to learn the brass tacks of how government works in its institutional structures, its political sort of influences and shaping mechanisms. And that's where I am today. And the reason I use the environment as a vehicle for understanding these things is that, especially environmental problems, or at least to me, they're like a really interesting union of questions that you would think only need technical or scientific answers to find out what to do. But as we've seen, like that isn't enough. Facts isn't enough. It's also the politics, the perceptions. So environmental problem solving and framing, to me, is like one of the best ways to understand the union of these sort of contradictory but necessary ways of knowing to make sense of the world.
I appreciate that, and the curiosity that you had to dig into that as well. Um, I've been a bit of a policy nerd for a while now, so I'm excited to kind of dig into some of the questions I have. Like, so I know it's been a bit of a whirlwind over the last 6 months. Um, what have been the most significant shifts in U.S. environmental policy? Let's start at the federal level, over the last 6 months. And what do they signal about the broader political climate that we're seeing?
In typical academic fashion, I'm going to slightly reframe the question to move in the last 6 months. But I think to really get a feeling of the broader sort of movement we're seeing in environmental uh, politics and policy and law, I have to go back to a year. It's almost a year ago during last year's summer Supreme Court session where they were releasing decisions. A little over a year ago, like late June, the Supreme Court overturned uh, the Chevron decision, Chevron deference. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, since 1984, the Supreme Court said that if and when there's ambiguity in a congressional act, agencies have the discretion to interpret that ambiguity. And from then on, for the last 40 years, it's had this sort of statutory, almost like uh, on high idea for the past 40 years of Chevron deference that agencies are the experts. So when Congress, because of lack of expertise on Congress's behalf, or the political process creating an ambiguous sort of law, that then it's agencies with their expertise have the discretion to do what needs to be done to actually bring that theoretical law into practical policy reality. And that was applied across all policy areas, but especially environmental areas. The EPA, yeah, the Clean Air Act might say, yes, here are two somewhat vague authorizations for uh, why to protect air quality and for which groups. But the Clean Air Act and even its amendment in 1990 didn't really have specifics on how to do that. So it's given the EPA a lot of leeway, especially under Democratic administrations, to kind of lean into that use of discretion to broaden regulation, broaden and environmental quality requirements. But last June, the Supreme Court said, no, that's actually not good law anymore after 40 years. And now it's basically, oh, whenever there is ambiguity in an act of Congress, it's judges who are the ones that then interpret the best way to understand that law and the best way to actually make policy. So that basically leaves us in a weird stage where it's now judges deciding how many parts per million of lead is okay in water versus water and water chemists at the EPA. And that's just sort of the culmination of a 20-year debate in politics of what is the role of government, more or less authority for regulation. And broadly speaking, the political right, conservatives want less government authority and regulation. The the left Democrats want more of it, and this Supreme Court, a six conservative majority, they all six of them said, yeah, overturn Chevron. The case is called Loper Bright, if you want to look it up. So beginning then, a year ago, and now under this new administration, beginning in January, we've really seen like a related aspect of that. Like back in March, the new EPA administrator Zeldin released a huge press release, and there's a web page on it on the EPA website of like, oh, here are like 12 really big things that we want to roll back that mostly have to do with energy regulation, um, uh, water quantity and quality things, So that was a lot to begin with. But I guess to answer your question, the past 6 months has been a trend at the federal level of deregulation, undoing a lot of the work that has been done over the past 30 years, but especially undoing a lot of the work done under the Obama and Biden administrations. And not just undoing, but taking a cue from the Supreme Court, really changing the way environmental regulation is done or not done. So one big example, before I am quiet for a little bit if you want to ask any follow-ups, is back in March, April, the White House said, hey, we're trying to work on deregulating a lot of clean air and clean water provisions. In the meantime, if you as a corporation or as a manufacturer want an exemption, please send us an email to this brand new email address, the White House, and we'll review your case on a case-by-case basis to give you an individual waiver to be exempt from certain Clean Air and Clean Water Act exemptions, which is just not the way this is supposed to work. It's supposed to be kind of a blanket provision across all industries. And so this sort of basically executive edict of, oh, we'll give you a case-by-case exemption is just really, really different, somewhat unprecedented way of doing environmental regulation. And that is the trend so far over the past 6 months.
It seems like a lot of burden then is getting placed, especially on the court system, if judges are now deciding these instead of the EPA. Interesting.
And,
Oh, go ahead.
and,
Sorry.
and on that note, that's sort of on like the legal scholar side of things. That's what they're saying is like this just really doesn't make sense because most almost everyone wants to do it as least as possible. But now with this decision, Loper Bright, to your point, Dr. DeRosa, judges now need to do a lot more work. And a lot of judges don't know the difference between nitrogen oxide and nitrous oxide, which is one of those chemicals is what makes smog. The other chemical is the one that you use in dentists to like
The
numb you
laughing
and knock you
gas.
out.
Yeah.
John Oliver has a joke that you can only mix up those chemicals once before it's a tragedy. And we've already seen a Supreme Court justice in a decision confuse those two chemicals. And so yeah, it's making judges do a lot more work that they don't really know. So it's just not setting up the public welfare for success, in my opinion.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Well, I guess also one of my next questions, which I feel like you've started to answer already, is to what extent have recent court decisions or congressional actions affected the authority of federal agencies like the EPA in advancing climate or environmental regulations? Um, do you have anything else that you'd like to add to that, other than what you've already explained?
Yeah, like again, Chevron being on the terms of open bright, that's just a massive thing, not just for
Mm.
environmental things, but just when it comes to uh, agency discretion. But there's a few other sort of smaller things that might seem small, but are part of this larger trend. The one I want to highlight here in terms of like Supreme Court decisions, other than Loper Bright, is one that kind of flew under the radar, but it's interesting. It's the city and county of San Francisco versus the EPA. And I think it's interesting because most people, when they think of the city and county of San Francisco in California, it's like sort of a liberal, progressive bastion of politics. But it was actually the city and county of San Francisco, specifically their Public Utilities Commission, that asked there to be not a lower standard, but a different way of giving out permits for water pollution, which in a way creates more water pollution. And so environmental groups and the Supreme Court sided with the city and county of San Francisco. And environmental groups absolutely dislike this because in a very real way, it will create more water pollution. What the city and county of San Francisco argued, however, and it makes sense if you're being honest with yourself, is like cities should not be held completely accountable for all downstream pollution. And this is something we see over and over again in a lot of cities, especially in the West, that has a lot more water quantity and quality problems. That when the city pumps water back into rivers after they've treated it, at their point of at their point source of pollution, they're meeting Clean Water Act permits and regulations. But then when the EPA takes measurements further down the river, when agriculture or other sources have added to the river, then it doesn't meet the Clean Water Act anymore. But since cities tend to be the biggest sort of permitted polluters, they're the ones found to be on the hook. So on the one hand, it's like, oh, the city and county, they have a point. But what this has done, it's shifted all clean water regulation, not just for cities, but also other polluters. And given the current composition of the Supreme Court, it makes it seem, and most likely is, that they're more amenable to doing the same thing, not just with the Clean Water Act, but with the Clean Air Act, RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act. And that's sort of the trend from like, and that's sort of the history of the Supreme Court decisions. One small decision opens up the door for the Supreme Court, given its current demographics of a conservative supermajority, to kind of chip away at other uh, historical precedents. So those are just two examples of uh, Supreme Court stuff. On the congressional side, the biggest example, most recent one, is the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, the Mega Fund, or the Mega Bill. One of the many provisions in it was to roll back many, if not all, of the Biden era Inflation Reduction Act provisions when it comes to clean energy credits, renewable energy credits. What the Big Beautiful Bill did is take all of those away. So now there's very little incentive, if at all, to produce more renewable energy via solar panel, wind turbines. We're seeing a lot of oil companies that had diversified their portfolios because of these energy credits to do more wind and solar. They're now dumping their renewable portfolio or dumping the renewable aspects of the portfolio and leaning back into more fossil fuel fracking, offshore drilling kind of stuff. So one of the kind of hidden elements of the Big Beautiful Bill is going to have really big environmental impacts on CO2 emissions, energy bills, a lot of knock-on effects.
I think we should rename it, maybe not Big Beautiful Bill, but Big Polluting Bill. No, thank you for explaining that. Yeah, because there's been a lot of news coverage of it, but not always getting into the environmental side of things. So I appreciate that. What role, I know your current research has been really digging into conservative environmental values. So I'm curious, what role are conservative environmental values currently playing in shaping US environmental policy? And are you seeing any evolution to those values or nuances to those values? And I ask this also personally because I have a lot of family members that are very, very conservative. And I find that I mean, they're not without environmental values. So, but it's
Yeah.
sometimes just maybe a different perspective than what I would originally have anticipated.
Yeah. And Jen, thank you. I love this question because it is a bit of a paradox. Like I have my PhD training in Idaho, and for those of you who don't know Idaho, it's a very red state, a Republican supermajority in both of its houses in the state legislature. And at the same time, it's a very, very outdoorsy culture. They love their public lands, be they state or federal. They love uh, hiking, camping, fishing, hunting. So something I share in my classes, it's when you see conservatives, Republicans, both in the public and politicians and pundits, say that they don't believe in climate change, and if it is real, it's a or if, that it's not real, that it's just a hoax, and if it is real, it's human caused. Like that their perception of that is that. But they also really enjoy, to your point, Jen, like they want to have clean environmental spaces with plenty of game that they can hunt for them, like their grandparents did, for their children to do, for their grandchildren to do. They want clean water that they can go and fish and recreate in. So it's not that there is this sort of complete uh, disagreement on enjoying the environment. What it comes down to, and what I'm researching, is how sort of the more political, partisan aspects of this plays into these things. And what we're seeing now in 2025, in my opinion, is just the culmination of a 40-year debate starting in the 80s with Reagan. The current things we're seeing with the EPA are not completely unprecedented. The Reagan administrations did this already. The first Reagan administration, the first EPA administrator under Reagan was Ann Gorsuch. And if Gorsuch is familiar to you, that's because she's the mother of current Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch.
Mm.
But she was hired to dismantle the EPA. And for the first 2 years of the first Reagan administration, she was doing a pretty good job of taking away its teeth, taking away its capacity in terms of funding, scientists and staff to monitor and report and enforce and give support to states to do a lot of this work. But then there was pushback, not just by Democrats, but also Republicans, because everyone started seeing hold up, yeah, we love the idea of getting government off our back. What's the Reagan quote? The eight most frightening words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So they loved that. The general Republican conservative trend since the 80s of smaller, more limited government that uses its authority to provide economic incentives to change behavior versus the more liberal democratic view of big government authority and use that authority for regulations through fines and fees to change behavior, kind of with a stick. So all that to say that the trend has been ongoing for the past 40 years of, especially in environmental spaces, Republicans, conservatives, of smaller government, more limited authority, let the free market decide, let the public decide what they want through their state legislatures, more so than the federal government. And so all that is winning. That is currently, that's what we're seeing the EPA do now. Similar to what Reagan was doing in the 80s, but now, if I may say so, the current Trump administration, Trump 47 administration, is a bit more successful with it, because over the past 40 years, the polarization of our partisanship has just increased. So in the 80s, after a while, there was a bipartisan pushback to the deregulation at the EPA. But right now, we're not seeing that. We're seeing applause. And there's been some limited research done on this, surveys, but some surveys, when they ask conservative folk, would you be willing to pay more money for a fishing and hunting license to help manage game? And they don't mind paying more for that. But if you ask them, well, would you be willing to pay a little bit more in taxes to fund environmental protection agencies to help with clean air and clean water? They tend to be very much against that. Even though they know it might, have an impact on their air and water quality. And compared to 40 years ago, that seems to be a trade-off they're willing to make because of partisanship. And that's what I'm currently looking into, trying to work on, what, if any, is there a threshold to that? At what point in how many boil water warnings does someone need to get before their mind changes on, oh, maybe we do need more regulation of water quality, even if that means giving more money and authority to government? And I'm just not sure where that threshold is.
That's really interesting. And I like how you frame that, because I imagine there's some state of cognitive dissonance that can be sort of, I don't know, or shown to folks that feel maybe one way about paying more for a hunting permit and ensuring that you've got healthy wildlife versus you're still out there, walking around scouting, and yet you notice the air quality and water quality is very poor. So to me, it feels like there would be, they're very similar. And so some sort of state of cognitive dissonance would help someone. But again, I'm recalling also from my family members saying, government shouldn't have their hand in everything, and they tend to screw things up when they do get their hand in everything. They don't do what they say they're going to do. So I feel like at the heart of that, there's a distrust as well. So you've given me a lot to think about. Another question I wanted to ask, and I know our title today is about environmental policy whiplash. So environmental whiplash often refers to the rapid policy reversals that occur between administrations. And I've heard that referred to also as sort of the pendulum, like it swings one way and then it swings back the other way. And inevitably, every person in charge has to make their footprint, right? Make their imprint, if you will, and change things. So what can be done to sort of buffer this flip-flop in policy because it's so volatile, especially if we're talking every 4 to 8 years. What can be done to buffer this volatility in terms of policy?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, I'm going to share a pedantic answer because my first instinct to respond to this question is that whiplash isn't a glitch or an aberration of the system. It's built into it. And in a very real way, whiplash is natural and somewhat necessary. Like whiplash it happens all the time. But to your point, and I hear you, it's especially a bit more when you're going from an administration of like from the Obama to the Trump administration, different political parties, the whiplash is hard. But we've seen that with any transition between administrations of different parties, even with new Congresses when a different party takes the majority. But we still even see whiplash between administrations of the same party. So between Obama's first and second administration, there was still whiplash there. Because even though there was still the same sort of overarching priorities from Obama, for between his first and second administration, there was new cabinet members and new
Mm,
agency heads. That even though agency heads and cabinet members serve at the pleasure of the president, they still have different ideas of how to do those things. So from top down, there's still going to be different ideas of how to specifically address climate change or not address it, how to address water quality or how to deregulate water quality. There's still whiplash in that sense. And I would argue, from the public administration point of view, that the best way to two things at once. On the one hand, whiplash is necessary and natural. So it's not about stopping whiplash. It's about mitigating the degree, it's the severity of the whiplash. Something I learned in my public administration training is that agencies, especially federal agencies, and especially big ones like the EPA, they're like cargo ships. It takes them a long time to shift tack. And if you have to change a little bit, that's okay. It'll take them some time. And also, if you study public administration, you know that agencies start having what's called um, organizational cultures, agency cultures. They like doing things a certain way,
mhm.
regardless of what the political appointees want, and even regardless of what Congress and the president wants. Feet dragging. At the end of every presidential administration, even if it's like at the end of Obama's first administration, all agencies kind of dragged their feet a little bit because even though they were kind of sure that Obama was going to win again, it's like if he doesn't, the Republicans going to want something really different. So let's hedge our bets.
Hmm.
And even if Obama was going to win again, which he did, they still kind of go, okay, he might win again, but a new appointee, a new political is going to come in. They might want to do this or that program differently. So let's hold up a little bit. You could argue that's the deep state, but that's just how agencies work. But what we're seeing now is really intense, really ideological whiplash happening. And when you have that, it's not just agencies shifting tack on some programs that are the sort of cornerstone of presidential policies and their sort of legacy work, but it really starts getting at like the core services that an agency provides. Um, and so like we've been seeing now in the past 6 months, broadly speaking, with like the Doge cuts or just tens of thousands of federal employees being cut and programs being cut. That's not just whiplash. That's the degree of this shift is getting at the most basic services that these agencies provide. And that's also impacting the EPA now. Um, entire science advisory boards, entire programs of scientists have been kicked out or fired. So the basic functions of air and water chemistry, soil chemistry, the EPA no longer has the capacity to do that. That's not your normal historical whiplash. So that's what I would say that is what needs to be insulated. a bit better. Not just whiplash in general, but this degree of whiplash that starts then breaking agencies, which then has very real impacts on the public. Not just sort of certain special interest communities, but the broad public. And the best way to buffer against that, it's going to sound like a deep state conspiracy. It's to have the senior executive staff of bureaucratic agencies not be political appointees, and to be, even though they must listen to the democratically elected leaders in Congress and the White House, the bureaucracy in a very real way is a buffer against really big whip changes in political whims. But we've also seen the current Trump administration kind of change the entire upper level of career bureaucrats. The current Trump administration has turned them into political appointees. So the last thing I'll say is that whiplash happens every 4 to 8 years, every 2 years with new Congresses. But the pendulum swing of broad political movement, that usually moves every 60 to 40 years. Like in the 1960s, we saw a really big swing to the progressive left of really big sort of civil rights Supreme Court decisions, a lot of really big, and the great environmental laws of our times, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, those were passed in the 60s and 70s. And now we're seeing the 60-year sort of pendulum swing going to the right now, a
Hmm.
really hard swing to the right. And at the policy level, what the current Trump administration, the current Republican majorities in Congress have been doing is that they've been changing a lot of rules of the system that are going to make it a lot more difficult for the pendulum to swing back to the left.
Hmm.
So it'll swing back to the left in a couple of decades, but the very rules of the democratic institutions are being changed so that it won't do that in ways we've seen in the past, in my opinion, and in a lot of legal scholars' opinions.
That's really interesting, and I really liked your ship analogy in terms of the turning of a cargo ship. You can't turn it quickly. I was thinking the phrase that came to mind, or the term that came to mind when you were talking about this, is sort of the bureaucratic inertia, or and beyond EPA, we've been seeing, like, with NOAA, the whole firing and disbanding of the climate assessment team, which is not so much just a whiplash as much as it is like a loss of institutional knowledge. I mean, you're completely losing knowledge in a situation like that. And when you hemorrhage that kind of knowledge, it's going to take much longer to try and piece it back together again. And then if you're worried about climate, you're like, we're running out of time. So yeah, it there's a lot of hand wringing associated with that. But I do also, for some reason, I find some sense of comfort in that this is kind of a broader cycle of swinging back and forth. And this isn't new. It just feels new, because we're on a different side of the swing this time, than maybe
Yeah,
most of our
and like,
life. Yeah.
yeah, and that's what I share with my students, which tend to be, 18 to 22-year-old folks. And again, I'm in my mid 30s. I talk about the 80s and 60s as if I lived it. No, I just read it. That's why I really enjoy hearing from people who lived, who grew up in the 60s, were adults in the 80s, and are currently seeing this, because with their perspective, they've seen the pendulum swing. And they would agree that right now, like, okay, something funny is going on. But at least they have the lived experience to go, but we've seen this happen before.
Mhm.
They lived through a really big upheaval of social unrest in the 60s, which we're seeing again today. And so having the perspective of time, on the one hand, tempers sort of the gut response of like, well, we're running out of time. And at the same time, we kind of are running out of time with some of these issues, not just with climate change, but a lot of the most vulnerable of us have always already been out of time. And the really big impacts to what you were sharing, Dr. DeRosa, like the gutting of capacity of a lot of these agencies, the most vulnerable of our communities are the ones who will get face those burdens and impact first. So they are running out of time because they never had the time to wait. And one more thing I'll share, and this is sort of, again, this is the structural part of this. Um, The federal government for the last 20 years has had a talent pipeline issue. There's been fewer people applying to government jobs, and the quality of those people has also not been the same as it was in like the 90s and early 2000s. And there's something called the Presidential Management Fellowship that since the 70s, the goal of the PMF was to recruit the best and brightest into government. It was also called the golden ticket into government. That if you got the PMF and you did your 2 years of probationary service, you're basically guaranteed a job in the federal government for life, and that fast tracked you to become a senior executive service. So you would be like the top level bureaucrats with institutional knowledge and expertise to make policy decisions. One of the first things the Trump administration did within the first month was to cancel the PMF. So a long-standing 50-year program meant to recruit and keep top talent in the federal government no longer exists. USA Jobs, if any of you have ever tried to apply to a federal job, USA Jobs has always been uh, difficult, to put it lightly, and now it's a bit worse. And I would argue, and a lot of folks have argued, that's all on purpose to reduce force and capacity in the federal government.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about USA Jobs, and you're right. It is. We could do a whole webinar on USA Jobs. Um, I also want to ask about the state level before. So at the state level, I know we tend to still be very much politicized at like blue states, red states, but have any regions or states recently stood out for their innovative or regressive environmental policy changes? Who should be paying attention to in terms of states?
The way I've understood this, the question you're asking, the way I often just think about it, it's always been a will and capacity issue. Like, for example, the states of the Deep South historically have had very poor air and water quality. So that would lead you to think, well, we need stronger, more stringent regulations in the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. Well, it's not that the Clean Air and Clean Water Act don't have good restrictions, it's enforcement. And so, to answer the regression side of your question at the state level, that's always been an issue. States that don't have the political will, that tend to be majority Republican controlled states, they don't want to abide by the federal standards, even when Republican are in power in Congress or the presidency. They don't want to do, again, I spent time in Idaho. It's like, oh, if the feds tell us to do something, we're not going to do it, even if what the feds are telling them to do is, ostensibly in their best interest. So there's always been will issues, but the bigger issue has been capacity. Because even if, like, say, Louisiana really wanted to no longer be 50 out of 50 in terms of air and water quality, Louisiana has a very rural, small tax base. They don't have a lot of state revenue. There's a lot of corporations that produce a lot of pollution in Louisiana, that produce a lot of jobs, but the reason they're cited there is because they were given a lot of tax breaks. So even if Louisiana had the will, they don't have the capacity. And a lot of times, the only reason states had the capacity, especially smaller, most often than not Republican controlled states, is because the federal government through the EPA gave them money to support these monitoring, reporting, and enforcement mechanisms. But now we're seeing that cut away as well. So, long story short, on the regression side, that's always already been happening. But now we're going to see Republican controlled states, which is the majority of states. I believe 35 of the 50 states are Republican controlled states in their state legislatures. They're just going to keep doing what they're doing, but now they have the thumbs up from the federal government and fewer resources, fewer help, or less help from the federal government. On the opposite side, um, you see your usual big blue states kind of pushing back. California, New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, but especially California, because California by itself is the world's fourth largest economy. They can they have the will and the capacity to do a lot of these things. California for decades has already had a higher air emission standards for vehicles, which the current Trump administration actually stripped California of the permission to do that. But California is still fighting for that. California's their state level of the EPA has stricter enforcement of clean air, clean water regulation, chemical storage and disposal. So California at the state level is really trying to do its part to respond to this. And when California does this, it has something called the California effect, because California is such a big market that corporations, even if they're not based out of California, since California tends to be such a large portion of the market, they start following California's regulations. So, for example, most car manufacturers, they don't just meet, or in the past anyway, they didn't just meet the federal EPA's car emission standards. They met California's, because California has 40 million people, but
Mm.
about 100 million cars. So
Yeah.
all that to say that, especially California, they're really trying to lean into their economy size, economy of scale, to really push their California effect in all areas, but especially in environmental areas.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I didn't realize it was called the California effect, but that does make complete sense. I was reminded of something when you were talking about blue states usually relying on external funding to address environmental issues. I used to live in Louisiana, and I remember right currently one of the biggest environmental projects that Louisiana spends money on is the restoring of the sinking coastline and the coast. I forget what the coastal management plan that they have for the entire state coastline. When you think about it, though, that whole thing is funded by money from the BP Horizon oil spill. I mean that it's essentially reactionary money to a terrible environmental disaster now being used to try and protect as much of the coastline as possible. Um, so it makes me concerned that we're going to see, especially in very, very red states, we may see this reactionary approach where there's fallout because people are getting sick because of the water or the air. And now we're going to have a lawsuit and spend money to try and fix it. Um, Unfortunately, I want to also remind our audience as we're getting into the last part of our talk, feel free to post a question in the chat and I will try to give voice to your question. And we already have some, so I'm gonna take one or two of those. Let's see, we have one that says, how do those who do not want to pay taxes to keep air or water clean expect the air and water to stay clean? Just human behavior?
Yeah. If I'm understanding the question right, it's like, how can you expect something without paying into it? And this is a version of the like free rider problem, or in like again, so topical. The example I use for the free rider problem more often than not, other than buses, is NPR public radio. A lot of us listen to NPR and we never donate. We are free riders. But now that NPR has been stripped of its federal funding, we probably can't do that anymore. But to answer this question, hopefully, if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's this idea of one, well, I just hope that the money is coming from somewhere. But the bigger philosophical idea is that, oh, the market will sort itself out. It's kind of like the application to environmental problems, like the trickle down idea, that the market will understand the problem, the public will be well informed enough to vote with their dollars and not support a corporation or a business that does things a certain way, which will then make the business fearful of its profit, change its behaviors. But we have decades of research that shows that doesn't work. And especially when it comes to environmental things, um, polluting businesses, their main goal is to externalize as much as possible. Because whatever pollution they can put into the public domain of air and water and soil that they don't have to pay for, that's more profit for them. So there's very little incentive without, in my opinion, without a stick, without government regulation to do any of this. So not a real good answer to this question, but That is the conundrum here. People hope and want clean air and water, but if you don't want to pay taxes to give government the capacity to do that, and you just hope that corporations will feel enough of a pain in their profit margin to change their behavior, which they historically haven't, I only see this going one way, and it's not in the public's welfare.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. Max asks, how has environmental policy research funding been affected in the last few years? What are your expectations for funding into the future in our chaotic world with cuts to many research programs and cuts to environmental items?
Yeah, to go in reverse chronological order in a way. In the past couple of months, we've seen entire research groups at the CDC, FDA, EPA, entire science advisory boards, groups of scientists researching a bunch of medical, pharmaceutical, um, um, environmental things. All the funding for that has been cut in government. So we're losing capacity in government in what has historically been the CDC is seen as the world's greatest medical research institution. And the current Secretary of Health and Human Services has been cutting a lot of that and replacing a lot of those research efforts with, as we've been seeing, a lot of, if I may be so bold, conspiracy theories. We're seeing the same thing at the EPA. A knockdown of this as well is that we see a lot of money being cut from these agencies, but also from like the National Science Foundation. And a lot of that money is what allowed hundreds, thousands of students pay for their masters and PhDs. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of PhD students get letters from their institution saying, hey, actually, sorry, we can't fund you anymore. Our as we've been seeing when like Trump or sorry, it's not just one person, the Trump administration cutting millions, billions of dollars from Harvard, Columbia, tier one research institutions. They've had to say no to PhD students, which also defunds their principal investigators, takes monies away from entire research labs. So we're having a huge brain drain, not just in government, but also in our non-government, public and private research institutions. So this is going to have not just the next 4 years impact, but a generational impact of brain drain out of the US. The last thing I'll share is that the Biden administration saw this happening. There's a fiasco that in the lame duck period of the Biden administration in the EPA, they were trying to push a bunch of grant money out the door. There's a quote from a Biden era EPA bureaucrat who said, we're trying to throw gold bars overboard before the ship sinks completely. Because they were trying to get all the money out of the EPA's bank account and into the bank account of nonprofits, research institutions doing all this work. The Trump administration and the current Republican controlled Congress, they thought that was deep state, shady stuff. They clawed back the money. And so, yeah, Max, very good question. Not a very rosy answer. My apologies. That's the state of it. This isn't just, oh, if we tough out these 4 years, speaking as if a Democrat were speaking, if we tough out these next 4 years and get our political strategy together, it'll be okay. In terms of research and academia and better problem framing and problem solving, this is a generational impact.
I think you've explained it very, very well. I feel from a research perspective, not a political perspective, just a research perspective, it breaks my heart to see. Um, I used to work a long time on doing outreach for the STEM pipeline, science, technology, engineering, math, um, which was this pipeline to ensure student kids could go from school and into the government, who hires the most scientists and engineers of anybody, even more than private sector.
Yeah.
And and I've seen firsthand how that STEM pipeline has completely got sabotaged. And to borrow an analogy, has been blown up. Um, I have I have friends and family members who have been like on internships, science and engineering, doing it at agencies that have just gotten fired. So
Yeah.
it's really, really sad to see.
One more
Oh,
thing to
go
add.
ahead. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry. Um, because it's the sciences, but also social sciences. My entire PhD was funded by National Science Foundation grants. If I had if I had gotten my PhD in a slightly shifted time frame, I wouldn't be here with you, part of this Goucher community, because I would not have had my PhD funded. I would have been one of those people who was given a notice saying, "Hey, I'm sorry, there's nothing for you here anymore." So, of course, STEM, that is for the brass tacks of what is happening, why is it happening, what are our potential solutions, STEM, absolutely. And also the social science perspective of when and where are the opportunities to make this happen? What are the challenges to it? We're also losing that as well in terms of the research and environmental community who wants to make progressive action on these things. It's a twofold. It's a multidisciplinary issue.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And thank you for adding in the social sciences. You're absolutely right. Um, Take another question. Actually, I might blend it. I might blend two questions. One question is, can you discuss how cyclical whiplash impacts underrepresented communities in the US? And then I want to pair that with, do you think the magnitude of our current period of whiplash is going to set a new precedent? Because I know you could said like every 40 years, or have we just totally messed up that normal cycle now, I guess is the question.
Yeah.
Whichever you want to grab first from those two questions.
Starting with the whiplash one, its impacts on underrepresented or vulnerable communities. As unfortunately, as always, the most vulnerable of us are always the first ones who have to bear the burdens. So, for example, in the EPA, from like day one of the current administration, almost the entirety of the EPA's environmental justice program was just gone. I have bookmarked like dozens and dozens of EPA environmental justice websites that now, if I go back to them, I get a 404 error.
Mm.
Like this website no longer exists. The only EPA environmental justice page that exists is just straight up Title VI, Civil Rights Act, Title VI legal stuff. All the financial support, research support, all that is gone. And even though that has always happened, because like I mentioned earlier, normal whiplash usually impacts the more sort of superficial, primary, like big ticket presidential uh, priority stuff, which depending on the party, oftentimes has to do, especially if they're Democrats, has to do with serving vulnerable communities. And then Republicans come in, they tend to cut those. That has always been part of it. But to really underline it, that this time around and connecting it with the overall pendulum swinging, this is a new version of it. Like, for example, outside of the environmental space, even when it comes to national security and Department of Defense, the renaming of several dozen Navy vessels for specifically the renaming of Navy vessels who had the names of members of underrepresented communities. Like that serves no practical purpose. That is, in my opinion, a purely ideological signaling. And we're seeing that across the board. So to try to give a more succinct answer to the pendulum swing metaphor, like I shared earlier, that's always been a thing. Has always been a thing. Another non-environmental example, Roe v. Wade as a Supreme Court precedent was decided in the early 70s. But for 50 years, it's not like no one did anything to work towards overturning it. It took 50 years for a group of people in the conservative side of politics to test the cases, to push them at the state and federal level until eventually a test case made its way to the Supreme Court. That has always been the case. That's normal whiplash. But what we're seeing now, what I tried articulating earlier, is given the current supermajority in the Supreme Court and sort of the current Republican majority in Congress abdicating its constitutional separation of powers responsibilities to the executive, the pendulum is swinging in a really sharp way towards like a centralized executive authority. And if you read the Federalist Papers, if you read a lot of political philosophy, if you read current commentary, when the pendulum swings and it's held by the executive in a centralized way, it becomes much tougher for the executive to let go of it. Which that's a concern that's been shared across the political aisle. Um, Last thing I'll share, then I'll be quiet. For those of us who are old enough to remember, after 9/11, 433 members of Congress, which is almost everyone, only one member of Congress voted no to basically the Patriot Act, which is gave the federal government incredible authority to surveil us, our emails, phone calls, under the guise of national security. 25 years later, the CIA, the FBI, the executive office of the president still has that authority, and they're unlikely to give it up. So on the one hand, that is a validating point of the conservative concern. If you give too much authority to the government, regardless for what the reason, regardless which policy area it is, government is unlikely to relinquish authority given to it. What we're seeing now, though, is a ossification, a stiffening of the democratic norms and processes that would be used to have that pendulum swing back. And that's what a lot of scholars in my field are most concerned with.
Thank you. It's scary to think about. Thank you, though. I want to end on a more positive, action-oriented question, and I know we've got like 3 minutes left. So, for everyone who's watching, which I know is a range of students and faculty and just general Maryland community members and people elsewhere, um, Chris, what can we do to stay informed and engaged in shaping environmental policy, especially during this time where a lot of us feel like there's a lot of uncertainty?
Very good question. Um, I think I have three very basic responses, but hopefully with enough passion to make them feel less than just basic. Be informed. I know that's implied in the question, but I know it takes a lot of mental strain, especially now, to be well informed. Because to speak transparently, every day I wake up and the first thought that comes to mind is like, oh, what fresh disaster is upon us today? It takes a lot of energy to be well informed, but we be well informed. Knowledge is power. Because the next step is action. As individuals, there's certain individual behaviors that we can do, eat less meat, the usual things we know, eat less meat, consume less. That's all well and good. But these are institutional structural issues. Uh, Become a member of a city, county, state environmental group. Donate money to those groups. As individuals, we can't put boxing gloves on against these fights going on. But if you donate money to the Sierra Club, the Natural Resource Defense Council, these big environmental groups that have the capacity and resources to push back, do that. You can't do it by yourself, unfortunately, but you can become a group, an interest group that does do this. It's collective action. Vote. I'm not telling you how to vote, but vote for the politician, the state party, federal party, national party that seems to be in line with what you value in terms of environmental quality, protections, and things like that. So it's not a lost cause. It definitely isn't. But the last thing I'll share is this. The biggest environmental issue of our time is not climate change, it's partisanship. So as much as you may disagree with folks who voted for Trump or folks who voted for Republican members of Congress, understand why they did. Understand them. I'm not asking anyone to compromise with people who seem to want harm upon others, don't compromise with them, but understand where they're coming from. Because then you can engage in dialogues. They're not immediately polarized. You can engage with them with things that move them to vote the way they did. And maybe then, if we can address the root causes of still holding on to the American dream, still being able to live a comfortable life and not having to worry paycheck to paycheck, having clean air and clean water, and not having that be a trade off in something that's meaningful to them. That is what we need to do. And that's what I'll leave you with. It's it begins and ends with us being human to each other. And that my naive optimism is that the people who do think that the solution is to wish harm upon people they don't like, I think that's just the vehicle for a baser grievance of them feeling disconnected or disenfranchised. And that's something we can only solve together.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I love how you ended that too, and encouraging everyone to listen to the people that they're talking to. And I think that's the first rule of communication is learn how to listen so you understand where someone's coming from. And to steal a line from To Kill a Mockingbird, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. I really appreciate your talk today, Chris, and I know we're at 2:01, so I want to thank everyone for joining us. Have a safe rest of your summer, and I'll be reaching out to folks with the recording probably by tomorrow, and I'll probably reach out in the fall with some of our future webinars that are coming up. So thank you, everyone. Have a great summer.